How's everybody doing? Are you really okay or what? I need a little bit more energy. You know, we just ate, and for me to really be able to give you what I think I can give you, I need to have, we have a tradition called call and response in the black culture. So let me hear from you again. How are you doing? All right. Now, let me start off a little bit. Penny did a great job of giving some background on who she was. She had a nice slide, and Stephen, and I wasn't going to say anything about who I am, but then I realized that when most, especially black people, see University of Utah, they start saying, what kind of Negro is this? So I think it's important for me to locate to you who I am, all right? Now, I kind of I let people know when they ask me, where are you from? And some people say, oh, he's from the university, he's from Utah. No, let's correct that. Actually, this is home for me. I grew up just north of here, all right? So I am a child of Illinois. I went to Eastern Illinois University. I played football at Eastern. I'm a member of Omega Psi Phi. So I saw the Deltas take a picture with my brother Luke. He's an Alpha. So with all the rest of the Deltas in here, we got to take a picture so I feel better. All right? So I did my undergrad and my master's at Eastern Illinois. I got my PhD at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So I grew up here. All my academic and professional life has been in Illinois until I left after my wife completed her PhD at Illinois Chicago. We went to Utah. So they made us an offer we just could not refuse. So it happens, right? And it also speaks to the fact that black people will travel. If you give us a real job with some real money, we will travel. All right? So James Anderson, our professor at Illinois, wrote a piece, and this is off topic. I'm gonna go off topic a lot, because I like to tie stories into what we do, but he wrote a really good piece. He's a historian of education about these universities who refuse to hire black professors. And then in the North, right? The South basically said, well, we have a history, a tradition, a culture. We don't want black people. You up there are hypocritical. You say you do, but you don't hire them. And guess what? That was written about the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. But guess what? It's still happening today, all right? So we do everything that we're supposed to do. We get the degrees that we're supposed to get. We work hard, and then we can't get the jobs. So there's PhDs out there that's doing, selling real estate now because they can't get hired. So I'm at the University of Utah, been there for 20 years, right? My wife currently is the Chief Diversity Officer. She's a professor in educational leadership. So she's the interim Chief Diversity Officer for faculty. And so we are good being in Utah, so I want to give you a little background now. You miss something, and you realize what you miss when you don't have it, right? And so I always knew that my culture, was very important to me, and it sustains me. So you have to do much more when that is removed, when you are the minority, really the minority. Now, when I say Utah, even white people say, oh, gosh. I even know Mormons who didn't grow up in Utah who go to Utah and say, I can't handle this, and they leave. So it does require, you just think about if you had to leave right now and go to Salt Lake. Now, some of you don't even know where Salt Lake City is. You know it's in Utah, but you can't picture where in that state it is. But think if you had to leave today, uproot from wherever you are, and go there. That's a culture shock. It's a transition that you're going to have to deal with. And for people of color, we have to deal with it all the time, even when we are in places like this, all right? So it could be a majority institution, like Prairie states, almost 60% African Americans, what about 15% Latinx folks? But who controls this institution? That's the real question. Now that has nothing to do with what I gotta talk about. What I have to talk about is this crazy academic language up here, understanding the corollaries of offensive racial mechanism, gendered racism, and racial battle fatigue. Now, before I go to describing what this means, let me give you a little bit more background on who I am. My mother was a teacher in Chicago at Carver Middle School. Yeah. And so she retired out of Carver. My father was one of Dr. King's bodyguards until his assassination, then became chief of security for Jesse Jackson, Operation Breadbasket, which then became Operation Push. So that kind of shaped who I was. My mother was really a pro-black woman, and she kind of grounded me in my pro-blackness. And as some of my former students, when I taught at Western Illinois University for years, Dr. Zamani is one of my former students, called me Brother Professor. And that was because I was trying to give back to them something that was instilled in me to be mindful and respectful of the culture that is so rich and important that you have, that most of us are miseducated on. All right, so that's what my mother instilled in me. But my father, what I saw from him, he was often on the road, always gone, with Dr. King and then with Jesse Jackson, was this intolerance for bullies, this intolerance for racism, this intolerance for injustice. And so that's what motivated me to continue on. So I appreciate the one woman that mentioned athletes or football players can't be smart, because most black men who are professors have an athletic background, unfortunately, because we need more that's not athletes to go through. But athletics did wonders for me, and I was able to go on. I knew once I got a psychology degree, I had to get a PhD, because what can you do with just a psychology degree, right? So that's a little bit about who I am. But this topic, I could have just said, I wish would. The antecedents and ramifications of people of color being pushed beyond their daily limits. Does that make a little bit more sense to you? Because that's what my interest is. That's what I research. I want to know those things that tick you off and how you respond to that psychologically, emotionally, behaviorally, because at some points in our life, something is going to push us to that edge. I was just listening to some stories over lunch, and you can tell the emotions that people have dealing with racism on a day-to-day basis. Most of us deny it. Now, I heard that there was a pre-conference survey done, and that all of you filled it out, and nobody here has experienced racism, right? So nobody in this room has experienced any racism. Is that true? Is that not true? Okay, well, I heard something different. So I thought I had to get real basic for you. So let me show you something, if you just indulge me for a second, to see if this resonates with you.
Do I get stress headaches at work? Yes, definitely. From the moment I get in, it's, Denise, we need this. Because my name is Linda. Denise is the other black woman that works here. By 10 a.m., someone in the copy room makes a joke about Kobe Bryant, and everyone looks at me to make sure it's okay. And I smile like it's okay. But really, my head and neck are starting to throb. Then I spend the rest of the afternoon training my interns and answering their questions like, yes, black people use shampoo, and no, I don't know any good reggae clubs around here, and yes, Condoleezza Rice is very articulate. Why do you sound so surprised? And no, I can't tell you where to buy weed. And that's when I reach for Excedrin. New Excedrin for racial tension headaches. Excedrin RT works fast, taking me from oh no you didn't to I wish a mother would.
except for racial tension headaches. Fast relief for hundreds of years.
Well, you know, when your research touches CNL and they can do some comedy, that you might be on to something. That, well, they played off and called it racial tension headaches, but racial battle fatigue is real. And we're going to spend a little bit of time of walking through what racial battle fatigue is by building up to it, by talking about racial microaggressions and some of the other things that are components of racial battle fatigue. But what I'm going to do is step out at a more 10,000-foot level to speak about this so you can get a bigger picture. We've had Penny and Stephen do a great job of talking about it right into the classrooms and the behaviors that you can do in your classrooms. But I think we have to look at the whole student picture and people of color. So what I want to do is ask a few questions. What is the impact of racial microaggressions in the everyday lives of people of color? Are there short-term impacts? Are there long-term impacts? But how do we look at the whole experience? Not just when they show up in your classroom or in the office, but even coming to campus. What is that life driving from home to work or home to school? What are those multiple experiences, those daily experiences that they have that tells you a bigger picture about the stress that they deal with? And then once they come into classrooms, having to deal with hostile environments there or in the workspace. The body codes racism as a violent act. It's like Hank Aaron with a baseball bat hitting you and your body responding to that. So it's a violent experience, and we have to understand racism as that. It's nothing less than that. Your body codes it as a violent experience. Some people try to talk about racism as just an attitudinal thing, but it's much more than that to people of color. Then, most importantly, how do people of color resist? And that's fight back. That's important. We have to learn more about those opportunities and those spaces and places where people of color resist. We have to be able to teach our students those type of strategies to get through this society, because I don't personally believe that things are going to change anytime soon. Okay? So, let's go to the next slide. So, one of the things that when I was in this journey trying to understand more about the impact of racism, I came across this paper, Psychiatric Problems of the Black Minority by Chester Pierce. Dr. Pierce was a Harvard psychiatrist and professor of education. He had a joint appointment. And he's the one who gave us the term racial microaggressions, right? But in this piece, this quote that I have was really impactful for me. The major and overriding psychiatric problem of the black minority is the withering effects of racism. Hence, the social, cultural, and community aim must be to dilute, undercut, and eliminate racism. The withering effects of racism. What is that? How can racism wither a person's body away? Anybody want to jump out there and give me an example? Somebody must have read the notes. Who said that? Diabetes. What else? Hypertension. What else? Cancer. Yes. What else? What's that? All right, well, yes and no. Racial battle fatigue is very similar to PTSD. It has some similar things that occur into the body, but PTSD is more associated with major trauma and somebody who's taken out of a traumatic event, and then they have some normalcy, and then these symptoms occur. So if we look at veterans, they're on the front line. They see they're in a traumatic situation. They're removed from the front line. All of a sudden, these symptoms start to occur, right? When has people of color been moved away from racism? Have we entered a post-racist society yet? All right? So that's the only reason why it's not really like PTSD. So there's some different things, and we need to know more about what happens to people of color when they're not in a racist experience, but I don't know when that's going to occur. I'll say this as an aside. So when I talk to other groups, and I'm talking about the black experience, one of the reasons why the black experience is so withering is this. There's no global stereotype more prevalent than an anti-black one. In every culture, every center of this world, there's an anti-black stereotype. No matter where you go. Asia, Europe, Africa, Mexico, every place. If you look at the black person in those groups, there's an anti-black stereotype. Okay? So where can we go to find relief? Now, there are spaces and places that you might have different experiences. Like, so you might go to Africa and feel like, oh, wow, I'm around Richard Pryor said that. He got to Africa and he felt like, I was home. I felt good. But then you wake up and you see who's in charge in some of those places. And it happens to you all over again. So this withering effect is what I'm mostly interested in. And there's other scholars who talk about that, but Dr. Pierce said that these assaults to black dignity and black hope are incessant and cumulative. That's important to remember. Any single one may be gross. In fact, the major vehicle for racism in the country is offenses done to blacks by whites in this sort of gratuitous, never-ending way. These offenses are microaggressions. And so this is where he really introduced this term to us. Almost all black-white racial interactions are characterized by white put-downs done in automatic, preconscious, or unconscious fashion. These mini disasters accumulate. It is the sum total of multiple microaggressions by whites to blacks that have pervasive effects to the stability and peace of this world. Now, of course, we've extended that, and we look at people of color now. He wrote this in '74, and his primary focus at that time was on blacks, okay? So in my work, I've written with Terry Yasso and Danny Solorzano. We kind of expanded this, and we talk about racial microaggressions being subtle verbal, nonverbal insults directed at people of color, often automatically or unconsciously. They're layered insults based on one's race, gender, class, sexuality, language, immigration status, phenotype, accent, or surname, and they're cumulative assaults. I want to go back to Pierce a little bit more, just so you remember that he's positioning this as we must not look for the gross and the obvious, what we call racial macroaggressions. Most of us have been socialized through racial socialization to deal with those macroaggressions. It's those microaggressions that impact us on a day-to-day basis, that wear you out, that you don't think about sometimes because it's always there. It's always present, right? And so it wears you out. You don't have enough coping strategies because you don't think about them enough, right? And then Dr. Daryl Wing Sue says it's the everyday, whether intentional or unintentional, right? So it's in your workspace, it's in the classroom, it's those backhanded compliments that you might get, right? Oftentimes somebody might hear something like, "You're pretty for a black girl," right? How does that come across to a young black girl, right? And some adult women hear that, right? Dr. Daryl Wing Sue expanded our examination on microaggressions. And he says that they function at least at 3 levels: the micro insults, the micro assaults, and the micro invalidations. So the micro insults, he say, are often unconscious. Can anybody give me an example of what might be a micro insult fitting this definition? Yes.
My daughter says that her psych, she's a senior in high school, her psych professor would always tell basketball stories to Javon, her friend, who's tall and black but never played basketball. So he would always turn to him and talk to him, and it drove her crazy because, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes. Right here, then here.
Why people saying to you, oh, you're so articulate, as though you're not supposed to be.
Yeah. Yes.
I was just saying that you yourself used that as an example earlier when you said you're pretty for.
Right. My sons, when we got to Salt Lake City, one of them can't play basketball to save his life, right? And the coaches wanted to put him on the team right away. Oh, you're going to be our star. Just because he's black, he's supposed to play basketball, and he's supposed to be good. And he was not good. And so now, there was nothing he could do, and this is taped, and I shouldn't be saying it. So let me stop and move over here. Some of them don't get, the genetic skills or whatever, so. Right. Yes.
Or, I'll have been driving with my friends and we'll go through a certain neighborhood and they automatically lock the doors. Like they think that they're just going to be harmed just by driving through the neighborhood.
Well, I'm glad you brought that one up because we're going to have that come up in the studies that we've done. And somebody important is going to mention that. So some other racial microaggressions are racial slights, hypersurveillance, personal threats, attacks on one's well-being, and the list goes on, right? So it's these things that we can count, we can see, and it's numerous things that we take for granted that happen in our lives. And oftentimes, when we do interviews with people of color, they can't even recall the microaggressions that they've had, right? You have to give them a checklist and say, well, have this happened to you? And they say, oh yeah, that happened about a month ago. So if you just ask, because the coping strategies that we have, whether they're maladaptive or adaptive, if we focus so much attention on every racial microaggression that has occurred in our life, we couldn't survive, right? We could not survive. But the thing is, we do. And that's the most fascinating thing. And that's the thing that a lot of people are amazed with. And when I say a lot of people, I'm talking about white people, are amazed with the tenacity, the whatever that it is that keeps us going, all right? Some other examples are here that you might have experienced. This is a very common one. When I look at you, I don't see color. So what is that doing? It's denying a person of color's racial ethnic experiences. It's trying to assimilate them. It's this act of colorblindness. Now you reacted. Okay. Did you want to give us an example?
What, in terms of that?
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, when I started the current job that I am back in 2005, I don't see color. I said, you need to, because I'm all colorblind.
Right. Any other ones up there that you've had? Yes.
It goes along with the one that she just spoke to, sharing with my group earlier. I have a coworker who always says, oh, I have friends of all colors. I like purple friends, green friends. So I practice that, like, bring your purple friends to the company.
Yeah. Yeah, that reminded me of one. When I first started at the University of Utah, I was obviously placed on a diversity committee in College of Education. So it's a long table of professors, and we're supposed to be reviewing the syllabi to see how diverse they are. The concern was that white professors, which were in the majority at the University of Utah College of Education, weren't using research from people of color. They were using ample women, but they were white women, but none from people of color. And so we were getting into this discussion about why it's so important and why diversity is so important. And one of my white female colleagues said, well, I'm diverse. I have freckles. So now think of me and maybe one or two other people of color in that room. Now, and I'm a new faculty member, but I hate bullies. Well, I hate stupidity like that too. But I'm trying to bite my tongue, but I want to, don't let the PhD fool you. So other examples. Here's a very common one. As a woman, really, as a white woman, I know what you go through as a racial minority. So your racial oppression is no different than my gender oppression. I can't be racist. I'm like you. So it gets to what Dr. Luke was talking about in his resistor slide, right? So you can probably overlay his slide on a lot of these responses, right? What is gendered racism? Why is it important? Philomena Essett is the one who gave us this terminology back in 1991. Actually, I think she spoke about it earlier than that. But she coined the term, and at that time, she was really trying to define the particular problems of black women. And she said that they're narrowly entwined and combined under certain conditions into one hybrid phenomenon. So yes, they're black, and they deal with blackness, and they are women, and they deal with being a black woman. But she also goes a little bit further to talk about gendered racism also speaks to the experiences of black men. So they're black, and they have that in common with black women, but they're black men. One word, black men. She didn't say the one word, but other researchers have combined it to say we need to start to think about how black men also deal with gendered roles and stereotypes like the black rapist and what Dr. Quay had an afterthought about, the absentee father, because that wouldn't have probably happened to a white man. But the stereotype is that black men don't take care of their children. They're not around. So what they probably were doing, I would have coded it like this, and probably Dr. Essett, that was a racial microaggression towards black men, right? And in our studies, we've had black men respond to that. So we need to look at those experiences and disaggregate the data to see how it plays out in the lives of black women, but how that also plays out in the lives of black men. Because oftentimes what we do, and you can listen to scholars and you can read articles, when they say black, they're trying to be inclusive with black men and black women, and then they'll talk about black women. But oftentimes, I'm gonna show you in a second, when it's black men, it's not oftentimes presented as black men, it's presented as a race problem, a racial issue, unless it's something stereotypical, okay? And sure. Mm-hmm.
And it's regarding the black man part of it. Has there any work been done on the relationship? And it's more than a myth, because I have several sisters who can identify with this. And that's the way that if, black men do not look out, for want of a better word, for the black sisters in academia. Like they never support you. Do you think that is part of it?
Well, I do think there's some negative stereotypes, just like, again, with that, let's go back, with the stereotype of the absent black father. When I was thinking about that when he said it, the CDC, which is not really a friend of black people, put out a report that showed that black men are more involved than any other fathers of other racial groups. They pick up their kids more often, they walk their kids to school more often, they do chores more often. But the stereotype that we have of black men is so negative that everybody, even black men, believe it about ourselves except we good ones. Oh, I'm a good black man, so praise me because I'm one of the good ones. All the rest of them bad. So we'll throw our brothers under the bus, and most of us who go through higher ed, see, I'm off topic again. Most of us go through higher ed have never had a class or read a book that's really been written about the true experiences of black men. So we have nobody in front of us talking about it. Many of us hold those stereotypes about black men, and then we carry them on. So I personally believe that black men and black women are strong together. Are there some problems somewhere? Yeah. Okay. Danny Solano is probably one of the leading scholars in education that does work on racial microaggressions. And they gave us a model for collecting data and analyzing data, and they say that it's important to look at the types and context of racial microaggressions. So what Danny does is he looks at the targeted person, the person who's singled out. And that's what I do pretty much in my work, is I look at the target of racial microaggressions. And I want to know what's next, the context of racial microaggressions, how and where they occur. Most of us aren't doing that on our campuses. We know that these things exist, but we don't know where and how they're occurring because we're not asking the people who are experiencing this. And then he says the effects of racial microaggressions, which is the racial battle fatigue, the physical, the emotional, and the psychological consequences of microaggressions. So what's important is the types, the context, the effects, and then the responses. And he does a great job. I mean, he's looking at spaces, environments that have been created out of resistance that can offset racial microaggressions. He's looking at how people respond to it, like Dave Chappelle. He's doing a study on Dave Chappelle, Richard Pryor, Wanda Sykes, all these black comedians who use humor to talk about racism. Chris Rock, that are very intelligent people, but they use humor to make a point. And sometimes in that humor is something that's so much more valuable because it reaches many more people than one of us getting up here talking about a lecture after lunch, right? Lecturing about racial microaggressions. So that is mass produced, and people start to understand it even with the humor. So it's something important to look at some of these shows like Everybody Hates Chris. If you really analyze that show, many of us had those experiences like Chris did. Especially, I went to Thornwood High School. We were bused to Thornwood, from a black community to Thornwood. And once we got there, I'm like, oh my Lord, this is the first experience with white people I've ever had. And it wasn't that pleasant, right? And I mean, it was like the teachers had low expectations. The academic advisors, once you got to speak to them, they didn't give you the same advice as they gave to the white students. Fortunately, I was an athlete. I talked to some of the other athletes, said, well, what did he tell you? Or some non-athletes in particular. What did he tell you? And then they would tell me, I said, that's not what he told us. So the black students started coming together to talk about what we were missing from getting the advice from these academic advisors, these school counselors, right? So we need to look at the responses to racial microaggressions that individuals have and groups have. So let's look at this. Besides being I looked at this when I put it together, he was a very handsome guy. I kind of missed that. and not being stereotypical, but he is articulate, and I kind of missed that too. But what's really important about this 2-minute video is this. And Dr. Zamani, can you, because I'll get preachy up here, so let me know what I'm doing with time, okay? What's really important, I don't know if there's been a US president who has talked about race straightforward with passion and emotion as what he did here. And this was following the Trayvon Martin hearing, right? So right after that, he gave, watch what he says and how he looks. He looks pain, he's talking about emotion, he's doing what Danny Solano in his work describes. He gave context, he's going to give racial microaggressions, he's going to give responses, and he's going to talk about what individuals can do. All right, so let's look at that.
Talk a little bit about context and how people have responded to it and how people are feeling. When Trayvon Martin was first shot, I said that this could have been my son. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. And when you think about why, in the African American community at least, there's a lot of pain around what happened here, I think it's important to recognize that the African American community is looking at this issue through a set of experiences and a history that doesn't go away. There are very few African American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me. There are very, very few African American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me, at least before I was a senator. There are very few African Americans who haven't had the experience of getting on an elevator and a woman clutching her purse nervously and holding her breath until she had a chance to get off. That happens often. And I don't want to exaggerate this, but those sets of experiences inform how the African American community interprets what happened one night in Florida. And it's inescapable for people to bring those experiences to bear. The African American community is also knowledgeable that there is a history of racial disparities in the application of our criminal laws. Everything from the death penalty to enforcement of our drug laws. And that ends up having an impact in terms of how people interpret the case. Now, this isn't to say that the African American community is naive about the fact that African American young men are disproportionately involved in the criminal justice system, that they're disproportionately both victims and perpetrators of violence. It's not to make excuses for that fact, although black folks do interpret the reasons for that in a historical context. They understand that some of the violence that takes place in poor black neighborhoods around the country is born out of a very violent past in this country. and that the poverty and dysfunction that we see in those communities can be traced to a very difficult history. And so the fact that sometimes that's unacknowledged adds to the frustration.
And that unacknowledgement is what students of color are begging for, to acknowledge their reality. So let's look at what the president or former president, just said. So he talks about this interracial transference. This could have been my son. Trayvon Martin could have been me. He talks about what I write about, racial battle fatigue contagion. The African American community, there's a lot of pain. There's historical relevance. African American community looking at this issue through a set of experiences and a history that doesn't go away, right? This Saturday is the 100th anniversary of what here in Chicago? What is it? 1919 race riot. And that's had lasting effects on the black community. Almost 2,000 homes were lost. Hundreds of black people were killed. That's a traumatic experience for people here in Chicago. People like my family members, all right? So there's a historical piece. Then there's empathy. Very few African American men in this country who haven't had that experience. That includes me. From the highest office in the land, probably from the most powerful country, he shows that he connects to those people who are disfranchised. Then he goes on to these, some of them could be micro assaults, some could be micro insults, but he says the experience of being followed when they are shopping in a department store. That includes me. It happens a lot. Lots, and somebody said that earlier, right? Lots click on doors of cars. Elevator, woman clutching her purse nervously, holding her breath. Now, some of these are really microaggressions within microaggressions. Some people just code this as one experience, but you see the person, they're nervous for no reason, microaggression. Clutch their purse, microaggression. Hold their breath, microaggression, right? So that's a constant, rapid microaggression happening, and that hits the body like violence. Then interpretation. History of racial disparities, application of criminal laws, from the death penalty to drug enforcement laws, impact in terms of how people interpret the case. Very violent past in this country can be traced back to a very difficult history. Frustrated if they feel that there's no context for it and that the context is being denied. You could write a whole paper off of that speech. And that's really explains what people of color have to deal with when the context is not accepted, when the reality is not appreciated, and that constantly they have to deal with racial microaggressions. So, now that you have a little understanding of racial microaggressions and how they impact people of color, we need a better understanding of how to place this gendered racism, social justice in the center of our analysis. So, most people do this. Put their head in the hole when it comes to racism, right? Now, this actually is improvement over the last several years. 88% of blacks saying that there's much discrimination that they face, and whites only saying that they face about 57% in agreement with that, okay? That's actually gone up from about 32%. excuse me, I got carried away. I usually have a research assistant that does this for me, and they gone for the summer, so. So why gendered racism? ESSET gave us the language and actually the ability to start to interpret data better by saying, let's look at gendered racism. So look at this. This is actually New York City. Rates of police stops versus black men. The age is at the bottom. Rate of police stops up to 1,000 at the top. Is there a different experience for different people? It's pretty clear, right? So you have black men, and then you have the other groups overlaid on top of the black men, right? So if I were to ask white women in New York City, is there a problem with police stops and frisk? They probably would say no, right? If I were to ask Latinas, is there a problem? They might say no. If I ask Latinos, they might say, yeah, there's a problem with police stops. But black men, overwhelmingly. And so actually when they report this data, they say there's a high level of police stops against blacks. Really, there's a high level of police stops against black men. They just won't verbalize it. Because then that puts the center of analysis in a different position. We have to look at these police officers, not that they don't discriminate against these other groups, but who are they stopping and frisking the most? So there's more violence that's perpetrated upon black men by police officers. We have at least 300 on average deaths of black men unarmed by the police every year. About 15 for black women. Every year. But they keep saying there's a problem with police violence against blacks. There's something going on with the police department, whether systemically or whatever, against black people in general, but they really are playing this out on black men. And that's what we have to deal with, just honest data. So here's some of the results from the recent studies on police stops in New York City. All right. So, understanding racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue is basically the results of a psychological, emotional, and physiological stress overload from specific race-related relationships between a racially marginalized or oppressed group or individual and their environment. So it really is a disturbed person-environmental relationship. Okay? Some of the things that result from racial battle fatigue. Psychological ones. Frustration. Shock. How many of you been just shocked by what somebody said to you or done to you? Anger. Oops, sorry. Anger. It happened today. All right. Resentment, anxiety, worry, disbelief. All those things are going on. Behavioral. Why is this thing? I'm not touching anything. Some of the behavioral emotional responses, like John Henryism. So John Henryism is that prolonged high effort coping with difficult psychological Is that on the timer? See, that's why I need a good graduate student to get. All right. So I'm not good with this. But what we're seeing now is this used to be just John Henryism because they looked at black men. But now we see the same behavior. we're having the same behavior with black women. And I'll show a study on that in a second. Real quick, physiological, headaches, grinding teeth, clenched jaws, chest pain, shortness of breath, pounding heart, high blood pressure, muscle aches, indigestion, and all the other things that were up there. So, when you have a high degree of racial battle fatigue, and these things are going on, are you supposed to be able just to feel happy every day and excited about going to work or going to class or being amorous with your loved one? If these things are happening in your life, where you have headaches, frequent infections, taut muscles, skin irritations. I presented this in 2003 and to an audience at an academic conference, actually here in Chicago. And after I finished, I had so many people come up to me saying, now I have language, now I have the reason for what I've experienced. One brother, a professor, not brother professor, but a brother who's a professor, had rashes. And the doctors couldn't figure out why he was getting these rashes. But he noticed that he would break out every time that he had faculty meetings because of the tension that was in those meetings where he felt like he didn't have a voice to speak out about the things that they were doing that was clearly racist, right? Not accepting students for just made up reason into the program. And he's trying to defend those students. These were students of color. But they were saying, no, this one isn't as qualified as this other one. And there was really either no difference or the students of color were more qualified than a white student. So those type of things, that environment, if this wasn't on tape, I'll tell you some personal ones too. But maybe when they're not taping. So this came on CNN in 2015. Does the U.S. college campus have a race problem? What's your answer to that? All right. We won't spend much time there. But what I want to point out on this slide is that from at least the latest data that I had, 68% of black college enrollment increases from 95 to 2013 is attributable to black students who attend community college, right? But white students easily make up the vast majority of students attending four-year public and nonprofit universities. So what we see is many more students, black students and students of color, going to community colleges versus going directly into four-year institutions, which means that there's an additional responsibility that the community colleges have for the experiences of students of color, right? Not that the four-year institutions shouldn't have one, they should. But just because the numbers are high doesn't mean the experience is great, right? So remember what kind of institution it is, a historically white institution. One of the things I found out, I was invited to Washington, D.C. To the NCAA, the National Collegiate Athletic Association, to give a talk. And this was the leadership of the NCAA, so your athletic directors, so Division I, the big schools, your athletic directors, your senior women administrators, your faculty athletic reps, and then the brass in the NCAA. I asked them to raise their hand if they've had a racist event occur on their college campus. About 95% of them raised their hand. Then I asked them, how many of you have been asked or volunteered to be on a racial justice committee on your campus, or something that dealing with racism? Almost all the hands dropped. Disproportionately, students of color are athletes, or these athletic teams are disproportionately made up of students of color. And yet they have no role in their experiences dealing with racism on college campuses. And this was going up. And I haven't found many universities responding to this Trump effect. They haven't dealt with it head on. Community colleges, four-year institutions, elementary schools, where students were feeling fearful of their lives, right? So let's get rid of him. So for the third straight year, universities, college campuses have had white supremacists recruiting on their schools, right? Very strategically. 161 incidents on 122 different campuses across 33 states and the District of Columbia. So something's going on. And let's get rid of that. How many of you know that white supremacy and white terrorist groups are very strategic? How many of you know that they go to a campus community and they stake it out for a while, right? So what they're doing is they come to the college campus, they watch what's going on, and then they decide, is this a place where we can recruit or not? Typically what they'll do is they'll go somewhere, like what happened in university or in Utah, in Salt Lake City. They'll spray paint on a predominantly black church the word nigger. And they'll do that at night, and then they'll leave. They'll come back early in the morning, and then they'll watch from a distance who shows up to take that graffiti, that racist graffiti down. If it's just black people, they say this is a primary target to set up camp. If it's a collective community of people of color, whites included in that, they say this might not be the time or place. Another strategy is this. Let me go through these examples. So here's some of the examples that have been happening lately on campuses, but this is what I want to get to. They'll put that up. All across the United States, it's okay to be white. The purpose of this is to agitate white students when students pull it down and they say it's racist, right? So now, generally speaking, yes, it's okay to be white. But strategically speaking, for what they're doing, this is a racist use of this flyer. And it happened across the United States. They would come with this, get the white students agitated because white students and students of color were pulling these flyers down, right? And then they felt like their culture, their identity was being threatened, right? And now you have animosity. Then this flyer shows up. Showed up at the University of Utah, showed up at Salt Lake Community College, Weber State, Utah State, and other campuses across the country. Stop the rapes, stop the crime, stop the murder, stop the blacks. Now, at first, my university responded to this as racist, yes, but they didn't look at this from a gendered racist perspective. This is the fear of black men, right? So you might not be able to read the small print, but it says over 100 white women are raped or sexually assaulted by black men every day in the United States. Now, if that were to occur, there would be lynchings and shootings. So you know that's ridiculous. But if you are a society based on stereotypes and fear, something like that can elicit a response that you're looking for. The other small print says, blacks are 136 times more likely to commit a violent crime against whites than vice versa, right? Blacks commit 50% of all murders despite being only 12% of the population. Now, this is the same group that says the Jews will not replace us. That happened down there, was that Charlotte? Yeah, it's the same group, all right? So they agitate the white students, get them upset, hit them with this secondly, and then later they come with that. It's all right to be white. You have no need to feel ashamed of your people or culture. You have no need to feel guilt for the imagined sins of your forefathers. You have no need to say sorry because you are nature's finest. Be proud of your people, your culture, your inheritance. White people awake. Save the white race. All right? That's the systematic strategy of recruiting white students into these groups. And this is what students of color are feeling on these college campuses that we're not dealing with head on. So let's talk about what some of the students are dealing with. This is a study that we did just a couple of years ago. Trapped between justified anger and being a strong black woman. Black college women coping with racial battle fatigue at historically and predominantly white institutions. So, this study was very interesting. We had students from community colleges and four-year institutions. And some of the things that happened were this justifiable anger that black women should have, but wasn't given the humanity to feel that type of emotion because it was placed into a stereotype. They just going off, right? These sisters were feeling these kind of psychopollutants of racial microaggressions on a day-to-day basis. One of the problems that they cited was that, especially on the four-year institutions, campuses, that they were the majority of the black students. So they were taking the weight of this hostility, right? Some things like having roommates asking racist questions, and then you have to live with them, and they not knowing those questions were racist. Having people just feeling empowered to touch your hair. Now, I would think, and I think we did this in 2017, that the message was out, you don't touch a black woman's hair. But no, it wasn't, right? So touching their hair, asking when is the ghetto gonna come out of you, right? Saying things like, I'm more black than you are, right? One of the other things that was fascinating that we found was many of these things were by white women onto black women, that they were looking at these programs like Desperate Housewives or Real Housewives of Atlanta or something, Love and Hip Hop. So all of these type of reality shows, getting their information and then looking for you to act like that. So then when the black woman gets upset, she's being irrational, right? And then the strong black woman it's like a double-edged sword because you're, like I said here, you're creating double binds for black women in higher education. They have to carry the weight. And so what we're finding is that these black women feeling like they have to be so strong now are showing up in the counseling center because you're not given the opportunity just to be human, that you have to carry the weight of the world. So these were some of the responses that we got from black women in this study. In this other study, You Make Me Want to Holler and Throw Up Both My Hands, was on black men. Now, obviously, that's the Marvin Gaye title, but that's how they felt. That's how they associated things with us. And what we found in this study is that black men on college campuses were seen as a criminal predator, a possessor of ghetto-specific knowledge. So the professor would turn to them and say, which happened to me at the University of Illinois, in a doctoral class. Well, William, tell us about the ghetto. Like,